Hi, I'm Melissa, and this is the Book Break. And today we're going to be talking to an author who brings us more information on some topics that we might not know too much about. I'm just going to bring her in, Debby Irving.
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me on.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So Debby, your book is called Waking Up White, and you talk about some really important topics regarding race and how there's so many things going on that maybe we're not even aware about. So would you just give us a little summary?
Yes, I think it's important to start by saying I was actually on diversity committees for 25 years, post-college and pre what I would call waking up. I'd grown up in a white suburb, that's probably a redundant thing to say, north of Boston. And it turns out I was completely underprepared, ill-prepared to address any issues caused by racism. I didn't even understand what it was. So Waking Up White tells the story of how I went on to understand how being white had sort of warped my perception, how being white had allowed me to go through schools and an entire social world where we never talked about racism. And so I didn't know racist history. I was able to buy into all kinds of myths in the United States, like that playing field being level, which I totally believed was true. And I had no idea what systemic racism was. That took me so long to understand. And I didn't know there was something called the white culture. There may be people listening and all of this stuff has you going like, what? So I couldn't figure out a quick way to convey what I was starting to learn. And I couldn't find it in a book that I could just hand to somebody. And so Waking Up White is the book I wish someone had handed me to help bring me up to speed and get me understanding quickly, more deeply, how race and racism work in white people's lives.
Yeah. And something that I thought was really interesting about your story in this is that you talk about how you just mentioned some of us are living with racist ideas in our heads that we don't even know that that's what that is. And racism isn't necessarily about not liking any particular kind of person based on their background. It's often about not understanding them, not understanding ourselves or the world in which we live. And one of the things that I also thought was fascinating was you talking there about the GI Bill that I was completely floored about. But let's jump into this a little bit more. And can you define a little more for us systemic racism?
Yeah, I don't know anyone who had a harder time understanding it than me. So the GI Bill following World War II, this was the first time I learned something that made me go, I get why I get why and how it's systemic. So my dad was in World War II. He'd taken advantage of the GI Bill. I knew that, he and my mom, they bought their first home in the town I grew up in. My dad went to law school for free on that bill. So for anyone who doesn't know, the GI Bill was a 4-pronged government benefit package to returning veterans. Not only could you get free higher education and a government-backed mortgage, you could get a small business loan or a farm loan. So I'd heard about the GI Bill my whole life. My dad, my uncles, all of the men in my white world in Winchester talked about that GI Bill. One of the things I learned that really shook me awake was that the GI Bill was difficult to impossible to access for Black and brown GIs following World War II. And the first part of that I had to unpack was there were Black and brown GIs. Like, how did I not know that? In all my books, all my movies, all my family stories, anyone in World War II who was fighting was white. So it turns out there were over 2 million Black, Asian American, Latinx American, Indigenous Americans who were over fighting Hitler's racism, Nazism, only to come home and be confronted with not being able to take advantage of the GI Bill. And it's not that it said anywhere in the GI Bill that it was a white-only bill. It's that there were already barriers that made accessing housing, education, farm loans, business loans difficult to impossible for Black and brown people. And I don't think we have time in 10 minutes to unpack what redlining is, but for people who are saying, what barriers is she talking about? Google redlining. That was the barrier in the housing sector that made it so difficult for Black and brown GIs to go get a home like my dad did. And, this was a massive program. This was a $2 trillion went from government coffers to everyday people in the form of home equity through the GI Bill housing portion. 98% of that wealth went to white GIs.
Yeah, which is really fascinating to me too. I do feel lucky that I knew that we had, other things out there that I thought were helping everybody. But then when I learned more about this, I realized they're not. And I had no idea that all of our brown and black and, I mean, to me, our American family that isn't getting to get out there and take advantage of it. And it is no fault of their own. And it's not a matter of, I think there are out there stereotypes, and it makes me sick that there are still really strong and really wrong stereotypes about people of color. And I just think it's not that they're not smart. It's not that they're lazy. It's none of those things. It's that they have not been given the same opportunities. And for any of us to think that they have is wrong. And that's just something where, in 2020, we saw a lot of movement in the Black Lives Matter movement. And interestingly, people that were trying to be supportive and forward thinking and thought, well, white lives matter too. They're not getting it. They're not getting that we are already privileged just by being white, but we need to recognize that everyone is good and they have their backgrounds and their cultures, and we're not recognizing that and giving them the same opportunities.
Yeah. And, and I think a major contributor to that is this myth in the United States that the playing field is level, and people come from all over the world for that American dream. All you have to do is work hard. A lot of white people have a family story about, my ancestors came here, they worked hard, they didn't complain, they weren't looking for handouts. And if we don't understand the systemic inequities, we don't understand why our white ancestors were able to, make a socioeconomic move that Black and brown people often can't make, because these barriers, I mean, our mainstream education isn't teaching about systemic racism in general. We don't really see it in movies. And many people think that racism is just about liking or not liking people of color. It has so much more to do with understanding the depth of the inequities. And then if I believe the playing field is level, and I think that if you work hard, you get what you deserve, then I can look at white people who are achieving and say, see, like my ancestors did it. And I can also look at Black and brown people who I don't know about the barriers. So I put the blame on the individuals. You didn't work hard enough. You're not smart enough. You're a threat to our society. You want to live off the government. So it's like a Rubik's Cube. It all fits together.
Yeah. And it's such a difficult thing because, I am originally from Southern California, and I was lucky enough to grow up in an area with a lot of diversity. So I had friends from every walk of life. And I, as a young child, didn't recognize that my background was a whole lot different than theirs, or that they might have come from different areas. And I didn't know what their families went through or how that was different than what my family went through. And I think sometimes people will look at that and go, well, then we're all the same. Well, but we still have our differences. One of the things that I really thought was fascinating in your book was you talked about the school experiment, and you gave a story of a teacher that separated people by physical traits that had nothing to do with where they were from, it had nothing to do with anything. And just by treating the children in such a way, it made huge impacts. Tell us that story.
So this is Jane Elliott, brilliant educator, and you can look her work up. You can watch videos of what I watched. It's called Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, or Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. And it was the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and her students were saying, well, why would anybody kill a hero? What was that about? And she went home and thought about, how do I teach children what discrimination is? And the next day she came in and she said, okay, everyone with blue eyes, And I can't remember who she did first, but she split the class in half based on blue eyes and brown eyes. And let's say it was the blue-eyed kids the first day, they were given a whole bunch of privileges. And the other kids, the brown-eyed kids, were not. And she was harsh to the brown-eyed kids. So, at lunch, the brown-eyed kids, I can't remember, they couldn't sit at a table. Maybe at recess, they couldn't play on the playground. And what was really horrifying was how quickly the kids adopted their roles. So the kids who were privileged felt kind of puffed up and entitled about it. They also did better in their schoolwork that day. And the kids who were in that second-class citizenship status, they really felt it. It crushed them. It demoralized them. And the next day, she flipped roles and watched the same thing happen. The kids who got the privileges kind of got puffed up and lived into it. And the kids who were being in that second-class citizenship role felt the burden of it.
Yeah. And, that story has really stuck with me, I think, because I think, and I'm going to veer just a little bit on this, how we treat people makes such a huge difference. And while we can't say that, someone is this or that for any particular reason, I know that, and this is just a really small, very small example. I used to be really, really, really heavy. And when I was really, really, really heavy, people made really horrible assumptions. I must be, lazy. Like, we've all heard different keywords or sayings about people based on their physical trait, right? Fat and lazy. We've heard that one. Blonde and stupid. We've heard that one. We've heard people are, whatever those things are, we've all heard those things, but yet how did those get there? And I noticed also in your book, you talked about the history of how race determination even started to become a thing, how there was a man that actually defined race. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there was a series of people who started to define race back on the European continent. And there are a number of books. The Invention of White People is a good one that brings us back to Europe. I think actually this is hot off the press. This one is called Birth of a White Nation, the Invention of White People, and its relevance today, because something happened in the United States. And that was a moment when early in U.S. history, when in Maryland and Virginia, the plantation elite was working everybody really hard to make profits off their crops. And who was working? It was not just enslaved Africans. It was it was free people. It was indebted people who the deal was that you would work for a number of years and you'd pay off your debt of servitude and you'd become free. And so it was a hodgepodge of people who ate together. This author says they ate together, they played together, they worked together, they slept together. That would be the masses. And the workers started to rise up and demand more, just as we still see workers do in certain situations. And the threat of the masses, who were becoming actually violent in their protests, that was when the invention of white people happened, because they being the colonial settlers. This is a complicated story because it involves negotiations back with the King of England. But the colonial settlers needed a way to conquer and divide the masses. And the way they did that was they named one group of people white. And those were the British people, and created, as this author says, an underclass of people who are now we would know as Black and brown people, who lost a lot of rights. And when the invention of white people came along, this new group of people, white people, were given all these privileges to police, patrol, and control Black and brown people, the right to be protected in court, which Black and brown people didn't have, the right to carry a gun, which Black and brown people didn't have. So it's very much part of, we are not white. So Black people are not Black people. These are legal terms. These are classifications meant to control populations in society. So that all has a really complex and long history. Like I say, Birth of a White Nation by Jacqueline Badalora is a really good, it's not that fat. It gives you a lot of history at a short amount of space.
Yeah. Well, and you're doing something right now on your website that will help educate people, and tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, I think everything I do, including my book, I'm always creating tools and trying to find resources that would have worked for me pre-wake up. Like, how did I get to the age of 48? Because that's the age I finally started waking up. So here's a picture of my website. And if you notice, I ask questions. These are meant to be like little playing cards. These are the types of questions that I was asking, that I hear other people asking all the time. If you click on them, you get the answer. So I always say that, curiosity is the straightest route to overcome ignorance, because the better questions we ask, the more we find our way to information that's meaningful. There's also something on my website. So my website is really content rich. You can just find so much information on there for free. And it will lead you to other websites that lead you to other websites. So I didn't know where to begin in the beginning when I started waking up. And the other thing that I co-created with, this was the brainchild of Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. He's a Black man who founded the White Privilege Conference 22 years ago. So he is really committed to helping white people wake up. So we have this 21-day challenge that is meant to be like a 21-day curriculum, where every day for 21 days, you learn something. Maybe you listen to a podcast, you read an article, you look at our list of things to go out and notice in the world. You make an action. You follow a couple new people on social media. So we've got the whole thing, the whole set of resources there for you. We even have a cool little tracking chart. All you have to do is go in and use it for 21 days. And our hope is that on day 22, you don't go, phew, I'm done with that challenge, but you say, wow, I don't want to stop. I am learning so much.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's so important for all of us to try to learn more. And as a parent, I really want to help my children be more educated as well. And I think this is something that will help us. And the more educated we are, the more we can teach our children, so that the next generation is better at this than we are, and it's kinder. And I mean, this is something that, another reason where I was super interested in your book is that, back in the early 1900s and even in the 1800s, there were all of these amazing children's books that came out. And at the time, everyone thought they were great. Some of them are even Newbery Award winners. But today, if you go back and read some of those, you might be horrified to know that there are some really inappropriate mind frames and language. And this is something even recently that I've come across. And while I was researching it, is what also made me think of your book. Is I'm doing a revised edition of The Story of Dr. Dolittle, because as I was thinking about a book that I would do for my master's thesis, where I was going to redo a classic and just kind of clean it up a little bit and put a fresh cover on it, I thought, Dr. Dolittle, we've all heard of that character. I got into his origin story and I found the N-word in it. I found disrespect to the African characters, and I was horrified. And as I've researched it more, I found that it wasn't that Hugh Lofting didn't like Africans. It was that was the mind frame of the 1920s. That was what everyone thought was normal and acceptable. But today we know better. And as a parent, I think I can't present that to children. And so I recognize that when that one comes out at the end of August, I'm going to have some people that aren't super happy that I changed a classic, but I hope that they'll understand I want the next generation to be better. And I can't present something racist to them. So anyways, I really appreciate your book. I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I hope that our viewers will go and check out your website. We've got graphics on here that are showing your website, and we're going to put your address and everything right after this. So thank you so much for being here with us, Debbie.
Thank you so much for having me on, and good luck with everything in your life.
All right. Thank you. And thank you to our viewers. We'll see you next time.